Okay, I'm going to get started now. We'll sort of let the Zoom room fill up a little bit more, but I do want to make the most of the hour that we have with Salima this morning. So hello to everyone who's joining us from all around the world. We're really thrilled to have you here with us. Welcome back to what's now the 7th episode in our Transformer States conversation series on digital government and human rights. I'm seeing some familiar names in attendance. It's really great to have you back with us again. And for those of you who are joining this conversation series for the first time, a really warm welcome to you. I want to introduce really briefly the broader series of which our conversation today is a part. So this Transformer States conversation series was launched exactly a year ago, and we aim through this series to introduce a wide and diverse audience of practitioners, scholars, students, and others to the implications of digital government for the field of human rights. Every month, we interview an expert about a specific case study of the digital transformation of government. We hope to raise awareness of case studies of digital government which might be less well known, or to highlight an interesting and cutting-edge approach to a certain case study which might contrast to the dominant narrative about digital developments, which we're much more used to hearing about. We're keen to focus on the impact of digital government on human rights, as well as the implications of this digital transformation for actors within the human rights movement itself, so that activists and organizations alike. We've been exploring developments so far within the move to digital government in really varied contexts. So we focus, for example, as some of you know, on China, India, the United Kingdom, and Australia, among others. And we're hoping through this series not only to learn about the different trends and developments around the world and to raise awareness of some of those specific case studies, but also to allow our audiences to identify the many similarities in approaches to digital government and the similar narratives which surround all of this across these really different contexts. We're also hoping to highlight through these conversations some of the parallels between the harms and the exclusions that are being experienced throughout the move to digital government around the world, which cut across similar lines of class, race, ethnicity, gender, age, and ability, and which are especially harming the most marginalized across these different contexts. Today, we'll be focusing on Uganda's digital transformation initiatives, and I'd like to flag that next month, we will explore the introduction of digital technologies into the European Union's border control efforts. It's ramping up surveillance and pushing border control ever further away from its physical territory through the use of digital technologies. And then at the end of November, we will be looking at how a secret algorithm and the aggregation of dozens of public and private databases were used in Colombia to identify recipients for government payments during the pandemic. And we'll look at what the implications of that kind of approach to digital governance might be. You can register for those next two events now using the links in the chat that Caitlin has just shared. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce today's event. We'll be exploring the digital transformation of government in Uganda. We'll be looking at what's happening here, who's being left behind in all of this, what kinds of promises are being made here, and we'll especially explore how socioeconomic rights organizations are having to adapt to respond to challenges in this new context of the rapid digitalization of government. We'll be interviewing Salima Namusobia, and we're delighted to have such an expert on these issues here with us today. We're dedicating the final 15 minutes of the hour that we have to questions for Salima from the audience. So please do start sending in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the conversation, and sooner rather than later, so that we can avoid having a crush of questions all coming in at the same time at the end of the hour. I'm joined today by my colleague Caitlin Choffey, who's a research scholar with me on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project here at NYU Law's Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Caitlin's been working closely with Salima for about a year, and she'll give you a brief introduction to today's conversation. So Caitlin, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Victoria. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest, Salima Namusobia. Salima is the Executive Director of the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, also known as ICER, in Uganda. and is also an expert member of the Working Group on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And as Victoria mentioned, over the past year, we've had the privilege of working with Salima and her colleagues at ICER, alongside another Ugandan civil society organization called Unwanted Witness. And together, our three organizations have conducted a joint research project that investigated the impact of Uganda's digital ID system on the right to health for women and the right to social security for older persons. And this research culminated in a report that was launched in June of 2021, which documents the mass exclusion that has resulted from the integration of the digital ID with healthcare and social protection. So to begin today's conversation with some very brief context, while there have been many attempts to introduce a national ID in Uganda, the current iteration of the ID system was introduced in 2014 through a mass registration campaign that in the first instance aimed to enroll the entire adult population. And through this process, the government sought to collect a relatively extensive set of biographic and biometric information on each individual, to record this information in a centralized database, and to issue both a national ID card and a unique national ID number. And since 2015, the Ugandan national ID has been governed by a piece of legislation called the Registration of Persons Act, and has been administered by the National Identification and Registration Authority, also known as NIRA, which is a government agency that falls under the supervision of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And having a national ID in Uganda has become a requirement to access many different services, including registering for a SIM card, opening a bank account, and as we'll discuss today, accessing many public services. So to start the conversation, I'd say that we've often found that issues relating to digital ID and government digitalization efforts more broadly are often seen within the international human rights movement as an issue for digital rights organizations. So that's organizations that are working on issues such as privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, and sometimes free speech. But Salima, you're obviously the executive director of an economic and social rights organization. So could you perhaps start by telling us a bit about the human rights issues that ICER works on traditionally, how you've approached this work, and also how this led you to be involved in the issue of digital ID in the first place?
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Victoria. Good afternoon for me, everybody. So straight to your question, Caitlin, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights seeks to address the gaps that exist in respecting, protecting, and fulfilling social and economic rights in Uganda and the African region, and to improve the government and private actors' recognition and accountability for this category of rights. Our programming focuses on areas such as health, education, citizen participation, economic inclusion, social protection, and business and human rights. We always work to ensure that all people enjoy these rights and live in dignity, regardless of their social and economic status or background. So ISA particularly focuses on vulnerable groups like women, older persons with disabilities, and children. Therefore, as a social and economic rights organization, we did not set out to work on digital ID, but we actually stumbled on it as an issue that was creating a barrier for people to enjoy their social and economic rights. And initially, this came up as ISA was monitoring the implementation of the Senior Citizen Pilot Scheme, under which older persons receive a monthly cash grant. We learned while doing that monitoring that there were many qualifying persons who were missing out on getting the cash grant because they did not get a national ID. And this was initially during the pilot, but subsequently there was a national rollout where the government now sought to have all older persons who are 80 and above within the country to be able to get the cash grant. And they used the national ID register to determine the beneficiaries of that cash grant. So they sat in Kampala and looked into the national identification register and just sent to the local governments the list of people that they found in their system to be 80 years and above. So this naturally excluded so many people because from the research that we all conducted, we found that a third of the adult population in the country does not have a national ID. So for us, it was really concerning getting to see 80-year-olds and above struggling either using expensive means or being carried to cash distribution points only to be turned away simply because they did not possess a national ID, although all officers would actually acknowledge that they would ordinarily benefit, but for the ID. So it was also more concerning for us that many of these older persons had tried to actually register to get the national ID. But because of various challenges here and there, with the system of registration, they had not been able to obtain that ID. So this became something that we took interest in, simply because of the exclusion that was happening. And subsequently, we saw, and also after engaging in the research together with NYU and the unwanted witness, we saw that the ID was now being mandated for other services. We saw this in access to healthcare, for example, and many people were being left out, including mothers who were seeking maternal health care and children whose mothers did not actually possess the national ID. But we also saw it rolling out, being required for vaccination initially, and perhaps later I'll get a chance when we are talking about how we've gone about the advocacy. I will talk about what we did when there was a suggestion to use the national ID for people to access the COVID-19 vaccination. And recently we've seen that also in the process of distributing cash COVID-19 relief for vulnerable groups, we saw that the government again required people to have the national ID. And also, aside from the national ID, people also needed to have a phone because the money was being transferred via mobile money. So for us, this now became a core issue for advocacy because the requirement that move towards digitalization was standing in the way of access to social services that are critical to the enjoyment of social and economic rights.
And so you mentioned the National Identity Register and also the use of mobile money. And I wondered if you could pinpoint for the audience exactly what is digital about the Ugandan national ID system. So what types of technologies are being used and where are they coming into the process of social service delivery?
Okay, so the National ID Register is an electronic database, and it has been relied upon to issue national identification numbers and subsequently to issue to people the national IDs. And during the registration for the national ID, the officers input a lot of individual biodata into the register, into the system, and they capture people's photos as well as the biometrics of individuals are captured into the system. Now, this has also been a source of problems as they seek to capture the biometrics and the biodata because we've found many cases where there are errors people's information has been input wrongly. For example, age has been misrepresented, and many people have missed out on services, for example, social protection because of their age. People's names have been misrepresented, but also the biometrics have been problematic because, you know, for many people in Uganda, they engage in hard labor, and this usually creates some kind of distortion to their fingerprints, and it becomes a problem. Sometimes people are registered, but after a while, they are not able to use their fingerprints for identification. But in some cases also, we found people who were told that they could not register for the ID because the system had failed to capture their fingerprints. And that means that has been a lot of older persons, for example, and that means that for as long as they are not in the system, they are not able to get that information, but also to get the services. But also we see that there are other services like bank accounts, registration for SIM cards that are reliant upon the national ID register, because this information is shared with these other entities, the telecom companies and the banks. And as long as you're not registered in the national register, then you're not able to also access these services. And naturally, this also creates problems. But outside of that, the digitalization also has created other issues for individuals, especially when you look at extremely vulnerable individuals getting dehumanized because the system just reduces them to a statistic, and you find that there is no room for looking at things, for example, like intersectionality, multiple vulnerabilities, and it is difficult for people's circumstances to be looked at as is, as opposed to just seeing somebody with a number who qualifies for a particular service. So in that regard, we actually find that the digital bits of the ID system are problematic. But of course, with the context in Uganda, you find that the digital bit of it is abandoned in many cases, because once you move outside of Kampala, there are many areas in Uganda that do, for example, health centers that do not have computers, and they are not able to look into the system directly. So officials will usually ask people to present the actual plastic card in order to get service. And if you've lost it, or if you don't have it, even if you have a national identification number, it becomes difficult to verify your information. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Salima. Thanks. That provides some really helpful context as well. This idea that the sort of surrounding digital infrastructure that is sort of assumed and that's supposed to be underlying a lot of this isn't there outside of Kampala. And that brings me to a question that we keep coming back to in a lot of our work. And that's, why has technology been introduced here in the first place, in your opinion? So why is the argument being made that any technology, and in this case, quite specifically, biometrics, so photographs and the fingerprints and thumbprints, as you mentioned, and this electronic centralized database, why is the argument being made that they're needed at all? And what are the kind of promises that are being put forward by the government and any other relevant actors to justify the introduction of these technologies?
Okay, now initially, the introduction of the national ID in Uganda was never linked to social services. As Caitlin mentioned earlier, there had been processes as far back as 2014 that were looking at having a national ID system for the country. And it was never mentioned. What officials would usually talk about is what really looks at the individual person, the registration, the national security. But subsequently, we saw introduction of a linkage between the National ID and social services under the Registration of Persons Act of 2015. This is where it was now written down that the national ID would be actually used, the national ID register information would actually used in the process of providing social services. Now, many of us, were very optimistic about the system, and we thought, especially us as practitioners for social and economic rights, who were frustrated by the lack of data in this country to inform planning, we were optimistic that this ID system would be useful in terms of planning for service delivery, in terms of implementation. And indeed, many people were hopeful. The officials now began to say that the system would be helpful in improving service delivery. But what we've seen in practice has actually been different. And it takes us back to where we started from, to actually look back at what the authorities intended. And these things like looking, for example, at national security, the fact that the country wanted to ensure that they track foreigners who are getting into the country, to ensure that they keep out people who are seeking to destabilize the country. But also when you look at the act, that numerous reasons that are given, they also link to things like curbing fraud, accountability, ensuring that only those who are deserving beneficiaries are actually the ones who are getting the social services. So in many respects, you see that the intention was to exclude the unwanted as opposed to include all people, because if it was for inclusion, then the ID would only be required at a point where government was absolutely sure that everybody was enrolled on the national ID register. But in the absence of that and the zeal with which the government is implementing this, then we do see it as something that serves national security, and also the ministry under which it is housed also is informative, because it's under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, as opposed to, for example, the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, that would ideally look at it from a more inclusive social service perspective. But Internal Affairs is something that looks at immigration, control, things that are seeking to exclude the unwanted, really.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point of looking at which ministries are heading up specific projects and kind of seeing what the kind of purposes, the real purposes might be behind some of these projects. And I want to kind of pick up on that and sort of ask you about what might be going on within different ministries and across government more generally within Uganda, because digital ID isn't an isolated instance of digitalization of government within Uganda. I want to kind of link that to the broader context of digitalization of government. So can you tell us how the move towards digital ID fits within broader efforts to digitalize government and public services in Uganda? And where else have you been seeing some of these digital technologies being introduced into public services and sort of intersecting with your work and your different work streams as a socioeconomic rights organization?
Okay, generally in the country, we see a big move towards digitalization in various aspects of work. We see that within, for example, the banking and telecom sectors, there is a huge move towards digitalization. If you set aside even the basics like opening of the bank accounts or registering for the SIM card, we see that there's issues to do with mobile money. Banks are also now requiring people to conduct business also more online, but also within the government entities. We see, for example, with COVID-19, that there was effort to digitize education. And this was problematic, again, because it exacerbated the inequality that already existed within that sector, seeing that for many children from poor backgrounds, children in rural areas that, for example, do not have the internet or do not have access to electricity, participating in the digital education move was very, very difficult, because even the gadgets like computers, phones, they did not have it. So this idea, which would be good if it was inclusive of all people, because everywhere the world is becoming more, the world is moving, using more technology in all aspects of life. But in our context, where we have a significant number of people still not accessing electricity, still not accessing the internet, then the digitalization, even just the basic know-how, even where a person has, for example, a computer, but the fact that they are not able to operate it, you find that efforts at digitalization are simply creating a further divide between the rich and the poor, who are not able to access this.
Just to pick up on that kind of question, I imagine that there are a lot of tensions here, where you mentioned, the inequalities in access to gadgets within gadgets and the internet and electricity in the context of education. But at the same time, the digitalization of the ID is leading to exclusion. So there are some tensions between improving the respect and fulfillment of socioeconomic rights within the realities of a government that's embracing digitalization. So how do you walk the line between arguing that a certain technology shouldn't be used at all in light of the digital divide and the exclusions that you've been seeing, versus arguing that the disparities and the inequalities in access to technology should be resolved to kind of reduce those inequalities? I imagine it's really context dependent, but I'd really like to hear if, in your opinion, there are contexts where digital technologies can play a positive role in the realization of economic and social rights, and any evidence that you've seen of the improvement of those rights through technology.
Victoria, the purpose of introducing digital technology is usually critical to determining whether it will be beneficial or not. And we see various examples where, if the purpose is to include, then there is some improvement, as opposed to where the purpose is to exclude. If I may think of, if I may give you an example of where the purpose was to include, was, for example, with the introduction of mobile money usage. This was meant for financial inclusion, to try and include people who were outside of the banking system. In this country, again, there is limited access to banks. Banks tend to be concentrated in urban areas, in places where people have the capacity to transact with the banks. But because there was a need to include more people, for example, farmers, the use of mobile money, for example, was useful. And we saw more people, not all people, because definitely not everybody has a mobile phone, but we saw more people being able to be financially included, to participate in the financial economy. But with the case of the national ID, where the purpose is to exclude those who should not be getting services, you find that the result is actually different. You're introducing it for social protection, just to make sure that a particular group of people do access the cash grant, and you keep out people that you do not want. Then also the exclusion, you're introducing the national ID to ensure that only those you consider to be nationals do actually get the ID. And there are a number of Ugandans who are Ugandans by birth, by all kinds of criteria, but they are not able to access the national ID system because the government has determined that they are not Ugandan. So in such cases where the purpose is essentially to exclude, then definitely it has negative consequences on social and economic rights, as opposed to circumstances where it is meant to include.
I think that's a critical point, right? To really think about the purpose of some of these systems and why they're being introduced in the first place. And clearly it's not always with the goal of inclusion. And so my next question is, in the face of these, what are clearly very complex policy questions, and also being confronted with some of these systems that were clearly not designed for the context of delivering social and economic rights, could you tell us a bit more about the kinds of challenges that your organization as a human rights advocacy organization has faced in trying to address some of these harmful effects of the digital initiatives? So, you know, what kinds of human rights advocacy have you found effective in countering some of the issues that have emerged? Perhaps most importantly, have you found that this differed at all from previous work that you've done? Has the digital component changed at all the types of advocacy or the methods that you need to use to be effective?
Okay, when you talk about challenges, there has been a number of challenges that we faced during the advocacy process. And a key challenge that we have faced as an organization is the lack of coordination among the relevant government departments and agencies that require us to reach each agency separately to say the same things. You know, so you will find, for example, that the senior citizen grant is being implemented by the expanding social protection program within the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, or that vaccination is being delivered by the Ministry of Health, but the holder of the data is the NIRA. The National Identification Registration Authority is the holder of the data. So in terms of being effective with advocacy, you would need to speak to these various government departments separately, although you're making the same point about the fact that actually use of the National ID Register is excluding a number of people. We also faced this with, for example, the Parliament, because parliamentarians represent constituents and they always have feedback from their constituents. They knew that actually the use of the national ID to access social services was excluding people, and it was a problem for them. So for many of them, their voters told them they cannot rely on the ID system. And indeed, they brought it to Parliament and they called upon government to delink social service delivery from the National ID Register because many people were being excluded. But you know, it's surprising that still, even with that, from all over the country, let alone the research that has been conducted by entities like ourselves, the government still is using this information to be able to deliver social services. So it's a challenge that you have to go to different places in order to make your point. And that means that the results come at a much slower pace than what would have been anticipated. But also due to the importance of some services, we've had to have rapid response in some cases. For example, when we received the first batch of COVID-19 vaccines, the Ministry of Health sent out a circular that was requiring people to present national IDs in order to access the COVID-19 vaccination. And as an organization that has been following COVID-19 very closely, but also that has been pushing for vaccination and, you know, taking the advocacy to all kinds of fora, we had to act very fast before the implementation could happen. And in this case, litigation came before any form of advocacy could be done. So together with Unwanted Witness, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights filed a case seeking an injunction to stop the Ministry of Health from implementing this directive to require the national ID. And in response, the ministry did reverse the policy but we see that still in practice around the country, there are officials that are still asking for the national ID in order for people to access social services, which we believe is really counterproductive to public health, especially with a pandemic like COVID-19, where it's clearly known that everybody will be safe when everybody else is safe. So it really creates challenges, and you have to flip advocacy sometimes in order to get the results that you want. But also there has been promotion of digitalization by other entities, international agencies like the World Bank, encouraging governments, providing technical assistance to governments and lauding governments that were moving towards digitalization. And indeed, the bank has praised Uganda for its digitalization process. But then the bank plays an important role. The government listens to it. So if they see the bank putting out research or putting out a document that is loading the digital ID system, and this report is not balanced enough to bring out the exclusionary impact of the digitalization, it becomes a problem, because as civil society, you know, comparing yourselves with a bank that sometimes comes with money, but also has significant influence because they provide also technical assistance to government and advice, you know, it becomes a challenge pushing back or telling the bank to also recognize the other side of the coin and ensure that also the negative impact is being recognized by the government, and advising them to go slow. But there are also other challenges, like countering the security argument. Like I said, many of our officials look at digitalization, especially in respect to the national ID, as a security issue. You know, keeping out people who want to destabilize the country, countering terrorism, and that is why they are linking it to all kinds of things like registering a SIM card and that kind of thing. So when you argue against security in this country, it is really a challenge, because, you know, people will say, okay, are you supporting terrorism? Which definitely isn't the case, because what we are doing is not to say that we don't like the national ID at all, but what we are pushing for is to ensure that it does not exclude desiring people from accessing critical social services.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think it's clear that the introduction of digital technology has changed your advocacy in different ways, some of which are kind of pre-existing tensions, like the issue with security and countering those arguments, but also maybe introduce some new complexities in terms of the speed with which technology is introduced, and also the role that international players like the bank and others are playing in pushing for these digitalization initiatives. And just to follow up on that, I think one thing that we've seen is that in the transition to digital government, when it generates these kind of new and existing forms of exclusion, there's often a large burden placed on civil society to assist the most vulnerable who are left behind. You know, when public services are disrupted by the introduction of these technologies, we've often seen that CSOs feel the need to adopt new roles to counter some of these issues. And I think you talking about the speed with which you've had to do that is a critical point. But are you also finding that the nature of your work has changed at all? Have you had to adopt any new activities or change at all the way that you work with communities in order to kind of counter some of those new dynamics?
Sure, Caitlin. ISA is not a service provision charity, but we've been forced to adopt a service provision role in some cases, for example, to help people access services from which they've been excluded. For example, with regard to the senior citizen grant, we've had to compile a list of people we came across that do not have the national ID to ensure that they get registered, but also we've had to carry officials to communities to experience exclusion firsthand. And in some cases, people have had to use personal money to assist people, for example, older persons who have not yet been enrolled onto the National ID Register in order for them to access the senior citizen grant. But we've also had cases where staff actually utilize their own resources or intervene in order to ensure that people get access to healthcare, for example, without the national ID. And in many cases, we've had to provide legal services, legal aid assistance or legal advice to people in order to assist them navigate the system, simply because so far they are being left out. So there are many respects in which this kind of system has changed the way we work, because mostly we are a research and an advocacy entity, and we do not do day-to-day legal aid service provision, for example, or direct assistance, for example, in form of cash. But there has been instances where we've actually been forced to do that.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it really sounds like your work has been changing quite significantly in a short space of time in terms of what you're looking at, and also what you're actually doing in terms of the activities as well. I want to move on to the Q&A shortly, so I want to encourage the audience to send in any questions that they have for Salima using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I see that some of our attendees that we have in the audience are here from social and economic rights organizations themselves who are present, and many of them will probably be thinking about what the role of digitalization of government within their countries and within their work might be. And they might be thinking about how they might need to adapt their work methods as well, and kind of look at some different issues and look at the intersections that you've been talking about. What would your advice be to some of these socioeconomic rights organizations and people working in this space?
Okay, it is a fact that currently many countries are moving towards digitalization. And as social and economic rights practitioners, we must ensure that such systems do not negatively impact the enjoyment of social and economic rights. We should be engaging in active monitoring and documentation, because evidence is critical. Like I said, you know, the proponents of these systems are usually showing the positive side of the digital systems. And without evidence, you know, you could make as much noise as you could, but you will not be able to move the powers that be to make the changes. So monitoring and documentation in all forms, you know, it could be reports, it could be videos, it could be pictures, you know, that could be useful to show what the impact is, having voices from the communities themselves to show the impact that digitalization is having on them is really critical, coming from us as practitioners. But also, many of us engage in advocacy, but like I said, and usually organizations will use advocacy as a last resort. But there will be times where rights are at stake, where you need to flip your advocacy agenda and you begin with things like litigation, or for many country contexts, there are different things that administrative steps or quasi-judicial bodies that you could go to. In our case, we've had to go, for example, to the Equal Opportunities Commission to argue the discrimination that is happening, partly resulting from the fact that there are people who are not on the National ID Register, but also, like I said earlier, with the vaccine introduction, we had to start with litigation before engaging in any advocacy, because time was of the essence and something had to be done immediately in order to protect rights. And basically what I would say is that social services are meant to be all-inclusive. And whereas there could be various benefits of digitalization, any form of exclusion resulting from digitalization is completely unacceptable, and it's contrary to human rights standards. And in context, if you find yourselves in a context like ours in Uganda, where many people are still not on the register, then you have to use all the tools that are available to you to be able to push back against this, because it is really contrary to the standards of human rights.
Thank you. I think that's a very comprehensive and excellent advisory answer. I just want to follow up actually on the very important point that you make about the importance of building up evidence to try and counter a lot of the good news narratives that we're seeing from extremely powerful and well-funded actors. And I just kind of wondered, a lot of what you've been saying has some parallels to a conversation that we had with Nanjala Nyabula about what's happening in Kenya with the Huduma number digital ID system, which she had said is also sort of designed to exclude and really has this kind of security angle to it as well. And then there are also parallels between what you were saying with older persons being excluded through biometrics not working, not sort of capturing people's fingerprints or photographs very well. There's a lot of parallels with what's happening in India with the Aadhaar system there. I was wondering to what extent you've had some cross-country collaboration and to what extent you're looking at what's happening in other countries and bringing that into your advocacy to sort of build up almost a sort of more global approach to countering what's happening here.
Okay. In terms of direct advocacy with governments, we haven't gotten to that point, but so far we've had conversations. We've been on panels, for example, with Kenyan counterparts, where we've been discussing what is happening across the region, sharing experiences from the two countries, but also colleagues have been part of discussions that have been happening with Indian organizations to share experiences. And it's interesting how much similarity there is in terms of what is happening across the exclusion that is happening with the use of digitalization, but the different actors that are pushing for this digitalization and the frustration that is coming from communities from the usage of, for example, the digital IDs, because for communities, they do not even understand, they don't see what the benefit is for them if it's not to exclude some of them from accessing these services. But also for a number of government officials, you find that they themselves do not also understand why they were being asked to actually ask for these national IDs, because, you know, some of them will say, oh, perhaps it's to curb corruption. Others will say, we do not know. Others will say we don't want non-Uganda to get services. We should only restrict them to services. Others will say, oh, even the refugees are coming for services, we should exclude them, which is ill-informed and should not be. But also next week, we are now taking the conversation to the World Bank. And next week, during the Civil Society Policy Forum of the World Bank, we have a panel that is coming up on the 6th of October. We are going to have panelists from Kenya, Uganda, and India. And again, people will be able to see how much similarity there is in terms of the impact that digitalization is having on access to services.
Great. So I mean, I think that clearly from some of the comments that we're getting, that really resonates the role of the World Bank and also looking for comparative case studies. So we have a question from Asher Goldstein, who's asking, you know, first of all, how do you see the politicization of this process in Uganda? Is it a broad consensus, cross-party, or do you see it driven by certain political constellations? And second, what do you see is the role of the African Union in policy transfers in terms of adopting these digital ID systems?
Okay, in terms of politicization in Uganda, I think the way that the whole architecture for the national ID, for example, has been done is excludes other political players. You find that, first of all, the ID system is housed within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but also key players from the start have been people from the National Army, and definitely the opposition political parties will look at it as something that is excluding them, because really there is not much conversation to be had with a system that is mostly using the military in order to implement the digital ID system. So even if there could be advantages and an opportunity, you find that there hasn't been much discussion outside of the political parties. Even conversations with the community, for example, haven't happened. There wasn't meaningful participation to get communities, first of all, to understand why was the ID being introduced in the first place, and of what benefit will it be to them as individuals, as communities. So to that extent, you know, many people look at it as a political tool. When it comes to elections, we had a big debate about whether to use the national ID register for purposes of elections, because people felt that there could easily be data manipulation that could keep many people outside of the system, and therefore keep many opposition politicians away from being voted. So in that respect, you could say in some respects there is politicization, because people look at it as a government thing, and we are not involved as a people. The African Union has to play an advisory role to governments, but again, this will have to come from evidence being collected from different countries. On our part, we are beginning to have these conversations with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, bringing to them the fact that, yes, there is talk about digitalization and how beneficial it can be in terms of easing service delivery, but in our contexts, it is still a challenge, and countries should really go slow in terms of requiring it as the exclusive identifier of who should benefit from services, because many people are still out of the system. And until we get to that point, which in my view would be many years from now, it is unwise for anybody to recommend exclusive use of, for example, the national ID. But it's the same thing, again, within the African Union, conversations are beginning to be had around education. For example, post the pandemic, digitalization will not deliver education in many African countries for children to catch up from the pandemic, because again, many of our country contexts are in such a way that there are so many people that are being left out of any technological advancement, either due to lack of electricity or lack of the internet or lack of any kind of gadget like a computer or a phone that can be utilized to participate in digitalization. But even basic things like using radio or television, many people do not have these. So the African Union needs to be more proactive as countries are designing their recovery plans in sectors such as health or education. And of course, it's obvious that for vaccination, we cannot be sitting and asking people for ID cards. Otherwise, we are going to be stuck with the pandemic for a very long time.
Yeah, great. And I think you've touched on this question a bit, but Alexandra Pardell is asking, what's the solution here? How does the digital ID need to be reformed? And should it be disconnected entirely from public service delivery? And I'll add a gloss to that slightly, because I think you've touched on some of this, but thinking in terms of both the short term and the long term, what are the short term solutions and what do you see as the kind of more long term conclusion to make about the digital ID system and its link to public service delivery?
Okay, having looked at the Ugandan system, we think, we believe that the wiser thing to do is to delink the national ID from service delivery, because like we said, a third of the adult population still does not have a national ID. And you're going to have many people excluded from service delivery. We think that in the short and longer term, we should concentrate on perfecting the birth registration system and ensuring that each child is captured from birth. And then you use that system going up in order to be able to identify people. But a system that has started with registration of adults, there are all kinds of complications. The other angle that we haven't discussed here is the complications of people who, in all senses, are Ugandan, but they cannot be issued with the national ID. For example, people who are of Rwandan origin, we have a tribe, Banyarwanda in Uganda, who've been kept out of the national ID system, and they are many. We also have people who are of mixed Arab descent. And they are also being kept out of the system because they are not being considered as Ugandan. Another community called the Maragoli has been in a protracted battle with the government to get the community issued with national IDs, including the Equal Opportunities Commission ordering that this group of people should be issued with national IDs, but still not all of them have got the ID. So for as long as we have these challenges, as long as we have these complications, it is wrong that we require exclusively the national ID for access to services. The other short-term thing that can be done is to recognize other ID cards. And indeed, when you look at our Registration of Persons Act 2015, it does recognize in the same act, there is the full birth registration process, for example. So if I'm a mother who has my birth certificate, why shouldn't I be allowed to present it for me to be able to access health services in the first place? It defeats logic that the same document that is catered for under the same law that creates the national ID is again seeking to say that, okay, if you don't have the ID, but you have this birth certificate, you cannot get services. It doesn't make sense. So these recognized IDs that exist within the law should also be utilized to allow people to access social services as we deal with the challenges that exist within the National Identification Register.
Thank you very much, Salima. And again, we're seeing some really important parallels with what we've seen in Kenya with the Nubian community, people of Nubian descent, who also are kind of being deemed not Kenyan enough to sort of receive the feeder documents to get the digital ID. And I think these are really, really important points, and it's important to draw some of those links as well to try and build that kind of counter narrative that you've been putting forward so excellently. We're at an hour now and we're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Salima, for all of your insights today into Uganda's digital transformation. This has been extremely rich and enlightening. Thank you, Caitlin, and all of you in the audience as well who have joined us from all around the world. We really hope to see you again at our next events in the series. So again, you can register using the links in the chat. Today's conversation has been recorded, and the recording, along with a blog post which will summarize the discussion and also provide some further reading materials, including some of the reports from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. We'll have that on the webpage for the Transformer States series in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much for tuning in, and see you all again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.